The before and after shot?
Okay, so who do we have here?
Chris Lowen.
Carlton team.
Kim Spears, Carlton.
Kim.
Ted Cohen.
My dad.
Lucia Dolcetti, Carlton.
It's Lucia.
Lucia, yeah, that's correct.
Steve
And-
Tirash.
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Good luck, folk. Here we are with the Ottawa University team.
Hello, I'm Mike McCauley. I'm in the MBA program at Ottawa U.
Morning, Mike.
I'm Blair Haddock, full-time MBA, Ottawa U.
Hi, Blair.
I'm Janet Bacon. I'm a part-time MBA student at Ottawa U.
Hi.
Hi, Chris Wilson, full-time MBA student, Ottawa U.
Nice to meet you, and good luck, folk.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you're comfortable with that logic?
Yeah.
Okay. And
I'm
then
sorry, can we illustrate this?
We don't have time.
they don't want to put
Are you,
details.
you enjoying
No, but is
the
it consistent
crisis
with what we
management point of the team?
Yes.
It is?
Okay, Chris, you and I, let's sit together and start working this out. Is that all right?
Okay, well, what do you want me to talk about? You want me to talk to the first 3 points, right? Okay, why don't we get the
The
So
screen there?
let's get one
no,
more.
what we'll do
Yeah.
is okay.
How does this relate to what we just said?
Okay. So
Okay,
what
you're on first.
Right,
What are you
so-
gonna do first?
I'm gonna talk about
There may be
taxation.
fewer
I'm gonna talk
smokers,
about.
Oh,
but
these
those
So I'll
people
talk
who
about.
are smoking
I'll
are still
introduce the
smoking
topic
the
in
same
the team.
amounts.
I'm introducing the
They're not quitting
background,
smoking because taxes.
Evaluation objectives.
They're finding other ways of
make
getting
the
their
reference to the
smokes.
stakeholder chart.
Right.
And then what I will do is talk about.
So if
these
we
two
want to
points,
try and
because
raise
my
taxes to cut,
3 points of mine is
it's
impact
declining
taxation,
because but the
tax
people who are
compensation,
smoking are still smoking.
and substitute.
the same,
if
not more.
So I'll
We're
do
not
everything to
stopping
slide
people
6,
from
and then you can do
smoking.
price.
They're just getting their
sensitivity
smokes
tax.
from us.
I want more than that.
You want
More
more?
than-
Okay,
What about 3?
So is it
what's
that-
happening
No, there is
is
more
that
than 3.
in
Is
absolute
there? Okay,
terms,
options?
the number of smokers is not changing.
Oh.
They get
It's in
inclusion.
relative terms.
Oh, we gotta get rid of that
that is
concluding
declining.
sentence.
The number of smokers
How do we get rid of that?
appear to be declining,
Just
but
hit
the
it.
amount being consumed, we don't think is changing.
So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4.
We don't believe it is.
Mhm.
So we think that
Don't
there-
forget, that's gonna be a heavy one.
if we want to use taxation as a mechanism to stop people from smoking, it's not going to work.
I want,
So it's going to work
Chris,
partially. right?
partially. How
It's
about
only
this?
partially, that's what we have to say, it's not.
this would be my favorite one to do.
But overall,
Okay, well,
You
smokes are
start.
still coming to the country.
I come in,
Like people, the
So
consumption, the
Sure.
consumption levels.
What has happened since the taxes and
yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the little go between.
think
I just,
we'll smoke
that's the
more.
one I'm keen on.
Okay, well, why don't you do the first 2?
You'll come in
And then I'll come in there.
and do this.
Talk about this, yeah, this, yeah.
And these are. And do you want to come in later?
No.
Are you sure?
Yeah. Quite.
This
Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's this one?
What is this one?
Taxation and tobacco consumption. How do we get into these things?
That's just the title, just, yeah. So that, I'll just talk, that's yours.
Taxation and consumption. So, introduce our team.
Mm-hmm.
First,
Thank them for coming, explain the situation with, what's his name? Who had the heart attack?
Alex.
Ed.
When companies decide.
Exactly. Talk about that. Make sure there's
Hmm.
Unfortunately, our colleague Alex is.
Yeah, do you want to write this?
It just says that.
This
We're
is
still
an
gonna-
illustration of this.
Yellow and legal pad.
Yeah, as a mechanism to try and stop
Excuse me.
smuggling by cutting back on our exports,
Mhm.
but with some sort of restriction, it
didn't
didn't work.
work.
Yeah.
No, because all that happened is more markets. The
Well,
market
so
Or they're
it is,
smuggling
Chris?
American
back to
cigarettes.
Bingo.
They're smuggling American cigarettes possibly as opposed to Canadian.
Sure, they just changed
Okay.
brands.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a recommendation.
Your lucky pen.
No.
There's no time for a lucky pen.
This is,
Did you guys want to make
Uh,
photocopies
Evan.
of that for the camera? Let's check. No, better not. You don't want to. You don't want to
no,
confuse
I
them
think
too much.
whoever
We
is
don't
going
have-
to speak must highlight this thing, right? Or not?
Okay,
So-
go through this with me.
Hold on. Can I get through? I just want to get my pen.
Who is talking about our plans here?
I will be.
I don't think they're particularly,
I didn't see a lot, but.
so we have to deal with that, because we know we're gonna lose revenue no matter what.
That's right.
So how do we talk about that? How do we, because we know that's not acceptable.
Well, what we're trying to do is nip it in the bud. We recognize that even though revenue is at an all-time high, with the increase in smuggling,
Yeah,
that trend is going to continue and grow.
And we have the figures of Quebec losing 150 million.
Yeah, but those figures are a bit inflated, because what they're talking about is that if they paid full tax up in Canada, I think they were paying full tax, the demand would drop, so we're not going to get all that.
Agreed.
I mean, if all the cigarettes exported in 91 were smuggled back into Canada, the loss in terms of the full tax rate is about $1 billion federal, provincial, for 900 million. federal.
900 million, that's what they're saying, yeah.
But if you dropped it, there would be less smuggling, and then the potential loss would be less.
I guess that's the idea, but how do we come up with some sort of, that's the thing, we have to sort of come up with some sort of figures that are going to give us an idea of what, we've got to do something. Otherwise it's just guesswork.
Well, that's right, okay, I'll put some numbers to it.
Okay, fair enough. We'll finish off with an evaluation mechanism. We should, I mean, because this is an evaluation, obviously, we should have evaluation mechanisms built in of some sort.
What if we did
Yeah,
the
linking
reduction?
back to our critical skills back.
Yeah.
What if we did the reduction incrementally? Just have a roll it back. I mean, it
Percent a
affects-
year.
What would,
it
what
affects
would
the
be the
timeliness.
advantage?
Adjustment
It becomes
for
a
everybody.
pilot study, and you'll know when you've reached the optimum.
Yeah, we could.
But we know in reality they didn't do that, so.
No, but I think this is a good solution. Pilots are being used more and more.
It might have been because of the political effects that were going on.
Well,
Point. Take a
Well,
big
I
cut,
guess you're right.
Take a big cut, you're gonna miss it. You do it in little steps, you can adjust the policy as you go
And
along.
you'll also see, for future input, how close it's getting. I mean,
And how
as you
sensitive
decrease,
it is.
how sensitive it is. If you decrease by 1%, not much happens, they continue to smuggle.
well, I see this being a recommendation, either doing it incrementally or it's sort of a big bang, but,
The question is how much?
and, you know, I need to know, we need to know something
Okay.
about the dollars. I'd prefer to do it all at once. I mean, we can talk about it, that would be a change, we would change our recommendations, that would be one of our recommendations,
How
do
much,
it.
how much do you think you want to change it all at once? I don't know, let me see if I can pull something from the numbers here.
Okay, so in the long term, what do we want to do? I'm missing things, unfortunately. Yes.
One thing
But
we haven't
isn't that-
talked about is the reliability of our different lines of evidence.
You're
Okay, but
absolutely right, we
conversion-
only got 2 lines of evidence.
That's right.
Where do we put our conversion? Did we put it in the medium or not? Where do we put that conversion? How do we put it?
Conversion, what, I'm sorry?
Conversion of tobacco.
Oh, God, no, we didn't put it anywhere.
Well, you should begin it immediately, but the impacts will be felt in the medium to long term.
We were just looking for long term, that's why it was.
We thought in the medium term, because the first, I mean, we're talking 1 to 6 months is short term. We thought consultations with various stakeholders helped.
Right, but that's consultation, but we also need to develop a program in the long term.
Oh, okay.
To get them dependent on.
Okay, so agriculture Canada, agriculture and
I think we need to be a
agri-foods.
little bit stronger.
First, I'd like to introduce ourselves to everyone. My name is Ted Cohen. My colleagues, this is Chris, Steve, Lucia, and Kim. And well, we've been working on this with Alex for quite some time. Unfortunately, he's not well right now, and he had a heart attack, and he can't make it. But we we assembled all the information that we could get from him, and we're attending this meeting with all of you. First, the issue at hand is evaluation of the effects of taxation on tobacco consumption. Okay, before we go into this very important issue right now, we should go a little bit into the background of what has actually happened. First, with our report, this has been an ongoing report for quite some time, and we still have a lot to do. But what we have some very clear findings, and because this issue is right now so critical to the government, we think that we have to do something about this critical issue that that the public is quite upset about. The media has been talking about this and writing about it incessantly, how there are all the smuggling boats in Cornwall, Mayor was shot in Cornwall, all these issues that were quite severe. And also, one of the issues that was most covered was what's going on in Akwesasne. So that's quite important. Next, impacts on taxation revenue. The government has raised taxation on cigarettes quite substantially over a number of years. What we are concerned about is, yes, smuggling has gone up over this period, but what will we do to replace this taxation revenue? It's quite a trade-off because the government has always been very involved or wanted to reduce the fiscal deficit. So, and lastly, a comprehensive review is overdue on this issue. 1991 was the last time we did anything with the taxation, went over the taxation on cigarettes, and right now, this process is the next stage in it. It's a very complex issue that we're dealing with, but I'd like to draw your attention to what we prepared here. It's not an issue that deals with either one department in the government or one key sector of our stakeholders. We have many stakeholders that we have to consider when we're evaluating this. Everyone from the provincial governments to municipal governments in Cornwall to First Nations communities, and it's even an international issue. We've had to deal with the United States government and even the state governments on this to try and stem the tide of flow of cigarettes across the border. So beyond that, we have a lot of people, certain groups like non-smokers groups, and even enforcement agencies, which we have to deal with. So it's quite complex, and that's why it's probably become so important right now in the press, because so many groups are touched by this one issue. Everyone who's concerned from enforcement, people are concerned about health. Okay. Now I'd like to turn the table over to my colleague, Chris Lowen. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Anyhow, before I get into this any more deeply, I'd just like to reiterate what Ted has said previously. That is that there were some limitations to the data that we had to work with. But overall, what we did, and the conclusions that we did arrive at, we feel very confident that they are the same conclusions that we would have had in the case where we had all of the data accessible to us at the moment. Anyhow, what the overall tax rates on consumption levels, this is very important as you know, for setting tax rates, you need to know what kind of elasticity there is and what kind of resulting decrease or increase in consumption levels you can expect. Substitutability of fine cut tobacco is another issue that we evaluated, which is important in dealing with whether or not cutting cigarettes or increasing the price of cigarettes results in people simply shifting the demand of fine cut tobacco, and whether or not the substitutability is perfect. And that's an important issue we want to talk about. The next issue is price sensitivity of young Canadians. This government is very, very sensitive to the issue that we're facing right now with the young Canadians beginning to smoke. Most smoking or smokers develop their habit before they're 21. So it's important to address this concern now as quickly as possible. And price sensitivity, as you know, can really impact that. And finally, the impact of a tax increase on smuggling. As Ted mentioned, smuggling is becoming quite a big issue, especially in the media, and I think that the general Canadian population wants to see some action in this area. Okay, first issue here, as I mentioned, will be the impact of tax rates on consumption. Now, I just want to make this as brief and as targeted as possible. So we'll just look at a couple of time series data. We've got 1968 to 1991, the real price of cigarettes declined, and the consumption of cigarettes increased by 2.8%. This is something to consider. Since 1981, the real price has increased by 162%, and the consumption has now decreased by 5.2%. So you can see a large increase in the real price has resulted in a marginal decrease in consumption. And also, price increases seem to be resulting in increased export levels and seizures as more of the tobacco companies will move their shipments across the border of the United States, and we believe smugglers are purchasing the cigarettes in the United States and bringing them back across the border. The next one, or next point that I wish to address is the substitutability of fine cut tobacco. As I mentioned before, sorry about the detail of the slide, but I think this is a very important issue that I wanted to tackle, and there are some very important points to bring up. But anyhow, fine cut tobacco here on the left is used primarily for rolling of people's own cigarettes. In 1980 to 91, tax increased by 520% on this product. It's also known as the primary non-cigarette alternative. From 1968 to 1981, consumption decreased, and from 1981 to 1991, consumption increased. This is important to remember when I go over this part of the cigarettes. Cigarettes make up 90% of total expenditures on tobacco products. 1980 to 1991, the tax on these products increased by 250%. Now, 1968 to 1981, consumption increased. Well, if you remember back here, 1968 to 1981, consumption of fine cut tobacco decreased. And 1981 to 1991, consumption decreased of cigarettes and increased for rolling tobacco or fine cut tobacco. So as you can see, the decline of the relationship is inversely related. Anytime that you have an increase in one, you have a decrease in the other.
Over the last number of years, our stakeholders have made it very clear to us that smoking is not acceptable in a lot of areas of the country, but particularly amongst young people. So we track what has happened with young people and the increase in prices. Our goal is, of course, to decrease smoking amongst young people. And we noticed that it was successful. This goal was successful, and there was a marked 4% by females. And there was far less, the variability for the females was much more than for males. Males, it was clearly declining. Females, it went up, then it went down. So just recently, it's been declining. Next, it was about 1,000% price increase over this period, which was 1985 to 1991 for cigarettes. So that's quite substantial. The next issue that we're going to look at is tax and smuggling. Right now, this is probably the hottest topic that we've got going on the press. Everyone's talking about it. It's in the news all the time. And our goal is, of course, to decrease or eliminate smuggling. Realistically, we know that regulation, enforcement will have an effect. We will not eliminate. We'll probably decrease if possible. During this time, what we learned was federal provincial tax between 1983 and 1991 has increased 1,200% approximately. Exports have also increased, exports to the United States by 540% during this time. What we believe is happening, and what most reports are showing us, is a lot of these exports are going to the States and coming right back again as imports, and they're being sold as much lower price import for cigarettes than what we're taxing. So definitely we believe there's a correlation between the increase in price or taxation and smoking, or not smoking, but smuggling. Options. What share of the revenue of tax revenue is generated by taxes on smoking? It sounds like a lot when we talk about $1.5 billion, but it really isn't. It's only about 4.8% in our calculation of the overall tax receipts of the government. So yes, that's a factor, but I don't think, if we're talking about a security issue versus an issue of revenue, security might be much more important for us. Next one, increase enforcement. Whether they'll be able to do very much is another matter, but the idea of perception that they can do something is quite important. This year we've been working more with the United States government and with provincial governments on this issue, but we feel there's a lot of room for us to move closer to them and work more with them. Also with our stakeholders, all of them from the First Nations communities who have played a big part in this, and all the non-smoker groups who are quite alarmed about what's going on, and the groups who are ranger on enforcement, all those groups we could work with more. Finally, increase education for young people. there has been a correlation between educating young people and a decline in cigarette smoking. So we feel we could do more of this, and this could also work into our perception. The perception that we're doing something which is just as important for us as a government. Chris?
Thanks, Ted. Well, the recommendation that we came up with is a combined approach that takes into consideration many of the options that we mentioned to you previously. First of all, we feel that developing partnerships is very important. The stakeholders, as we have shown, are very diverse, and there's quite a few. On top of that, the Aboriginal communities need to be consulted, I think, in an issue like this. For some communities, it's actually a form of economic development. The United States is somebody we should look into, and we should also try and increase partnerships with education institutions and try and increase the education awareness of smoking and its effects. We'd also think that any type of action that we take will involve consultation with the provinces. As you know, provinces have a great deal of taxation invested in cigarettes. So there's a chance that if we were just to eliminate the tax, they would simply fill the gap with their own. So what we want to do is make sure that when we do, or if we do reduce this federal tax rate, that the provinces have been properly consulted with, and that this vacuum isn't exactly filled in by them. And as a result, we simply lose revenue without addressing the problem that we really have at heart. Why are we doing this? Well, we think that reducing the tax rates, the federal tax rates on tobacco products, will have several beneficial effects. Primarily, the public is demanding action. The public wants to see a responsible government take an issue and address an issue effectively. We think that by reducing the tax rates somewhat, we should be able to accomplish this by increasing revenues, decreasing smuggling, and addressing the problems of lawlessness on border communities and in major cities. We also feel that it's cost effective. What we've seen is that the increase in tax rates that have come over the past few years has resulted in a decrease in revenues from cigarettes and tobacco products. And anyhow, I think that by decreasing this, decreasing the tax rate, the federal government will be able to claw back some of those lost revenues. And it's important in this time of fiscal responsibility that the government be seen as responsible. And also, I think that by increasing education, we can combat arguments from non-smoking groups that say that we're simply selling out children and teenagers, which I think is an important issue to address and should be a topic for the policy development. Finally, I think I'd just like to say that this recommendation we feel very, very confident about, even though that the information that we had to work with was limited, and we didn't have an econometric model on hand at the time. We did have a lot of the results that were calculated by our friend Alex before he fell ill. So I'd like to make sure that everyone on the panel understands that there's no reason for this information to be looked at as not being worth your confidence. Thank you very much, and
Turn it over to questions.
I think we'll turn it over to questions.
Your recommendation about having a combined approach with different stakeholders in forming partnerships and alliances, there seems to be an assumption here that you will have a common objective. And what I see for instance, you have some of those stakeholders who will respect and in fact have responsibility of applying the rule of law. And some of those don't necessarily share that belief. First Nations, for instance, view it as an inherent right to sell cigarettes. So how do you propose to reconcile those different values in your attempt to form partnerships?
Do you want to take that?
I'll take it. But bringing all these stakeholders are involved in some way. Bringing them into the fold, into the consultation process. We don't have any illusions that we will change any of them completely. But if we could bring them toward our common objective and keep them within the policy framework so that we'll find a compromise with them. That's our objective. Of course, some of these stakeholders have diametrically opposed ideas, and they will probably resist working together. And it is possible that some of the more adamant opponents of our policy might even drop out of our policy group, as we might call them. So that's a possibility on the more adamant ones, but we believe by working in consultation as we have, and even we worked on the Charlottetown Accord together on this, we brought in a lot of different groups who actually didn't work together before and started off with completely different ideas about what should be done. We believe that these groups will eventually come together and be able to find a common solution.
And I think just add, I think the drawbacks of not consulting far outweigh the problems that might be encountered in consultation. This government should be seen as somebody that's, or wants to be seen as somebody who's consulting the public and cares about important things. Any other questions? All the team members are open for questions. Well,
I'd be interested in your addressing what would happen if we do lower the federal tax rates if the provinces decide to pick up the slack and increase their taxes. How would you deal with that?
Well, I don't know if that's really our field to actually address that specifically, but I will tell you that is something that we consider, and it is an issue to address. And that is why I wanted to emphasize that we consult the province before we make any type of move like this. It's very important to remember and consider the fact that if one province does lower its tax rates and the other province is trying, or allows the tax rate to be reduced on tobacco products, and the other provinces want to keep it up for income levels, there will be a type of domino effect. Say if Ontario, for example, allows the price of cigarettes to drop, while Manitoba or Quebec does not, and you'll see smuggling replaced across international borders, it'll go over provincial borders. And I think for that reason, all provinces should be involved in this because it's kind of an all-or-nothing proposition.
I also have another question as the Treasury Board and responsible for regulatory affairs. We're looking at finding a more efficient way of developing regulations and so on, because we're the federal government is a state where no longer has the resources to properly enforce its mandate of its regulations. So from your analysis here in your study, what do you recommend? Should we invest more in public education? And if so, will there be over the longer term efficiency gains maybe, or less of a need to do enforcement type of activities? What's your recommendation?
With education, we found a correlation, not an extremely strong correlation, but yes, a correlation between education and you're talking about compliance in this, or are you talking about a decrease in smoking?
No, compliance.
Compliance in people not smuggling, or?
That's right.
I don't know how much of a relation. You?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, Andrew had stated that there can never be 100% compliance in very few situations when you're dealing with enforcement and compliance issues. And I think what you're going to have to do is kind of conduct some sort of cost-benefit analysis and look at, there are diminishing returns. If you constantly are putting money into enforcement measures, there's going to be some point where it's just not worthwhile, that the government will be actually losing money. So I think more research actually has to be done and looking at the variety of measures and also the impact of the decrease in taxes.
Yes.
I think there's some background work from Health Canada's point of view that Canadians are very concerned about the health aspect. And my concern is that your recommendations, in my view, don't spend much time being concerned about that natural increase in smoking that will occur as your prices drop. You haven't spent much time talking about specific policies that you would put in place to try to counteract that. And I'm very concerned that Canadians will see this as a serious problem, that just when we seem to be getting at reducing the smoking among young people shown by your rates of the 25 or 35% drops, that we're now going to be stopping these good results that are occurring, and we'll just see a rebound in smoking rates. I think both from Health Canada's point of view about the health of the nation and from the political dimension, I think it's a serious problem.
Yeah, I think so too. And
that the differential between taxes and has continued to increase. From this slide, we can see that over the years, up until the 80s, up until the late 80s, when the indexation changed, that the taxation is generally followed and was indexed to the price of cigarettes. When that came off, we can see that that the export of cigarettes has taken off. So more cigarettes are going down. Where are they going? We can't say for sure that all these cigarettes are coming back to Canada. But what we can say, if we look at slide number 2, from the tracking that's been done by the RCMP, there's a hell of a lot more seizures. So, and we've also, it's also been suggested through some of the Customs and Excise that 80% of cigarettes that are being sold are coming back to Canada. So there's a problem there. Why is that? Well, if I was able to buy in the United States for $22 for a carton of cigarettes, and yet in Canada the domestic price is $47, well, I think generally it's obvious why it's an incentive to bring it back into Canada illegally. We also have a second critical success factor, is also the maintenance of some sort of a deterrent, and of course involved in the price. So we have to build that in. As we said before, 40,000 people a year are dying, Canadian Cancer Society suggests are dying each year from smoking. And of course we want to maintain the tax revenue. As we said before, $3 billion a year tax revenue, but we are seeing that the government is losing $500 million a year through through that 80% of taxes that they're not getting their revenue from. Now, with that said, I think we can move into the next section. We have the objectives here, which we will restate, and on to the further analysis.
Okay, so before we get into presenting our alternatives, we wanted to just kind of spell out exactly how we're going to evaluate those alternatives once we get to them. Back up somewhere. Okay, there. So first of all, stakeholder input. Will the policy that's put in place invite input from all different stakeholders to satisfy those stakeholders that it is a valid policy? Will the policy be flexible enough to allow the minister to make changes in a changing environment? Will the policy be effective? That is, will the policy eventually allow us to reach our goals, which are from the objectives there, to maximize revenue, to increase the health, to ensure that there's compliance with the policy. Is the policy going to be efficient? That is, will the resources used to implement the policy be minimized? Will our costs be at the lowest possible level? And timing. We'd like to see that the reduction in smuggling can have a significant impact within a 6-month period, and also we want to look at back up. It's expensive. Enforcement always costs more money. It's low in efficiency and effectiveness, and the people, many of the people who will be hardest hit will be the kind of mom and pop retailers. The enforcement goes to that level, or to small groups off the reserves or something that are trying to make a living. Third alternative, pros. in the long term, the conversion of the tobacco industry should have very good benefit for the industry. There'll be an improved quality of health as we try and retain the jobs that are held within the industry, but yet move them in a more life-supporting area of activity. And such a thing we expect will have a broader base of support because it's simultaneously maintaining jobs, improving health, and not necessarily reducing the revenues to government because any losses from tobacco sales can be somewhat offset by increased taxation of the tobacco industry. Cons, we have a lot of conflicting stakeholder goals to manage here and increased costs. Recommendations, next.
All right, we've been presented with quite an assortment of facts and information. This is an extremely complex issue. There are many stakeholders. It's a very difficult type of thing to sort out. I think we put a reasonable framework on it. And the recommendations that we're going to make to you, I think, balance the competing interests and forces that need to be taken into consideration with this particular policy. The first point would be to immediately reduce the differential between the domestic price of cigarettes and the export price. We can do that simply by lowering the domestic taxation a little bit and increasing the export taxation. To move a little bit on each side, stakeholders on either side of the issue may not be as upset as if we took it out on just one side. The provinces, because they have jurisdiction over the sale of cigarettes in the provinces, need to be brought clearly on side to enforce the laws that they have. We see that happening now around us. If you've been into the corner store, you see that you now have to look at least 30 before you'll be given cigarettes without an ID. The third key element involves developing strategic alliances with the industry and other stakeholders. Cigarettes are killing 40,000 Canadians a year. I'll bet there's not one person here in this room that is not directly affected by cancer of some form that's caused by smoking. My father died of lung cancer. My wife's father died of lung cancer. It affects all of us. We need to focus on reducing cigarette consumption. We need to move the industry away from cigarettes and to do something else. The tobacco leaf, and you may probably not be aware of this, is a really good source of protein. The tobacco plant has the ability to be genetically engineered to produce pharmaceuticals. Some of that work is being done in Ontario today. We need to consider the alternatives. Okay, good. The barriers to the implementation of our recommendations, of course, are public perception. But the public in this case covers the broad range of spectrums. The anti-smoking lobby groups are going to say, you're not doing enough. Industry is going to say, you're cutting our profits again. The stakeholders, congruency of stakeholders, again, they have conflicting interests. If we move away from the production of cigarettes, what is that going to do to the economy? Nationally, we collect $6 billion in tax. That's probably 1/3 of the economic benefit of the cigarette industry in Canada today. If we make changes, how will that impact on the economy? And in this day of high deficit, increasing debt, that's a very important consideration. The cost of government, typically when you want to change your program, you end up paying out money. It's going to cost the government something in the transition period. All right, the implementation plan. Once the recommendations have been approved, we recommend that an immediate announcement be made about the new policy to the Canadian public. Once that has been done, we begin an ongoing awareness campaign to continue to educate Canadians about the perils of smoking and the risks of lung cancer, but in additionally how our recommendations will, over a period of time, improve or decrease smoking, while at the same time preserving the interests of the affected groups. And we would do this initially by decreasing domestic taxes by $2 and increasing the export tax by $2. A small move in each direction, but a $4 closure of the gap from 25 to 47, instead of being $25, it would now be 21. And at the same time, we would begin consultation with the stakeholders and with the industry to look at ways that we can move away from the production and the tobacco and the conversion of the industry. In the medium to longer term, we would look at, again, another increase of export taxes and a decrease of domestic taxes, perhaps by $2. But if we review it every 3 or 4 months, for example, the first cut will have had time to impact. Some adjustments will be made in the industry. We can have a look at what's happened to smuggling. And we can decide at that point whether or not another increase, decrease is required. If that doesn't do it, 3 or 4 months later, we might do it again. By moving incrementally, we can achieve the optimum balance between maintaining government revenues, decreasing smuggling, and decreasing the number of Canadians that smoke. And again, the alliances, the consultation that we started sort of early on, we would want to continue to develop those and work with the industry and the other stakeholders. I think this policy addresses the key things that we wanted to address. One was ensuring that Canadians who don't smoke now don't start. Reducing the impact of cigarette smuggling on Canadians, and particularly the affected communities in areas like Cornwall. And as well, we'll begin the process of converting this deadly industry that kills 40,000 Canadians a year to a more productive enterprise. Thank you very much. And cost-effective use. So it's both a pro and a con.
My minister is appearing before the standing committee, the finance committee, the standing committee, next Monday. So what, as Treasury Board, President, so what can I tell him for the cost of government of increasing enforcement?
Okay. The enforcement that's being currently done, the RCMP and the Customs and Excise are very active in the enforcement. They're doing things like patrolling the St. Lawrence River. That's where a large portion of the smuggling is actually going on. The cost of increased enforcement really takes two forms. One is the cost of the labor of the people actually doing the enforcement. And the other one, there's a tremendous political cost associated with it. The confrontations that occur. If you happen to injure somebody or somebody gets killed in the process, and often it's going to be an innocent bystander. There were a number of instances where boats collided when they were being chased by the police. The cost in dollar terms depends on how much you increase the enforcement. I mean, a police officer makes probably $250 a day. Increase, put a force of 100 or an additional 200, well, you can do the math on that. The political cost is something that the minister is going to have to weigh for himself.
From the point of view of health and welfare, I'm concerned that your overall policy doesn't spend much time or put much emphasis on health aspects, particularly for young people. Enforcement of existing laws is very nice, but we all know how innovative kids can be. And you're just going to be moving the smuggling down to a local industry for high school kids. I'm afraid for the ones that are over 19 to be feeding their younger friends. Do you have any other plans that you could bring forward that might deal with the young people, and both in a real, from Health Canada's point of view, concern about their health, and also in terms of the political fallout from this announcement, if we make it.
As you can see from our implementation plan, we were really geared towards developing a communication plan in the short and long term in cooperation with and in consultation with affected agencies, Health Canada being one of them. When I say communications plan, I mean advertising. We'll go towards dealing with advertising geared to the younger smokers in suggestion of the health risks and the possibilities of living smoke-free, for example.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We also looked at education, and through the cooperation, we want to be cooperating with the provincial agencies and provincial governments as well, because most of the education and the way of reaching young people is through the schools, and education has to be a provincial matter. We looked at consultation with the provinces.
Is there a cost associated with that?
There's always a cost of getting any large group of people together there.
Have you prepared a cost estimate for that?
No, we haven't. Just to add on that, this whole issue here is a matter of trying to balance a number of competing issues. The particular health of the youth versus the need to reduce smuggling. And that's why we opted for a policy that was incrementally reducing the tax rate on cigarettes to keep them as high as possible to provide that deterrent to the youth, but also keep minimizing to the point where we can find that smuggling starts to fall off.
May I raise a question about, you're very innovative about your thinking about transforming the industry, but as the Chief of Staff of Mr. Manley, I think that stuff is pie in the sky. You have any idea, is this feasible? Is it only dreaming about it? How easily could we convert an industry like this?
Well, I think we have a very good example here in Canada and in the United States, the conversion of the defense industry with the fall or the end of the Cold War. Defense is the biggest industry in the United States. There's tremendous progress being made in terms of base conversion and converting the military machine to more productive enterprise. And we're going through the same process in Canada right now with base closures. Base downstream right now, although the plan has not been announced, it's certainly being considered for a major film studio in Toronto. It's a prime site. There's lots of land there. Plans are being made. It is possible. But it takes the concerted efforts of government and the stakeholders working together to move in that drastic direction.
One of your critical success factors for the future was to maintain price of the smoking deterrent. How is that considered in your current recommendations if you're going to reduce the volume of consumption?
Comes back to my point earlier a little bit, that we want to reduce the differential between domestic and export, but we're not going to just kind of lop off a big chunk all at once. We're going to do it incrementally, bit by bit, until we find that optimal level where you're getting a reduction in smuggling and it's still being felt to be a deterrent for the youth. And also maximizing optimal revenues for the government in the process.
For tobacco, and in particular issues like whether fine cut and cigarettes are substitutes or not, whether younger Canadians are more sensitive to prices than older Canadians, and last but not least, the extent to which increased tobacco taxes have led smuggling. And one of the things I should mention is that the analysis that was done in this evaluation got underway, probably early in 1992, so that a lot of the stuff that was in the clippings that people had, nobody knew about then, so that smuggling became more of a problem as the evaluation went on. We found it to be a problem. Our data only went up to 1991. We found it to be a problem, but as Tom will talk about, it became even more of a problem as the 90s proceeded. And let me re-emphasize, this was only one element in some of the policy decisions that were subsequently made about whether or not to change tobacco taxes. So, it talked about the impact of tobacco taxes on consumption. What it found was a couple of interesting things. One was that the price sensitivity of tobacco consumers is much greater than anybody had estimated in the past. So that the price elasticities that this study came up with are almost twice as large as any previous studies on this issue. Now, there's all kinds of possibilities with that. But so one of the things that it says is that the price really matters. So that was one of the interesting findings. Another interesting finding was that it really, really matters for younger Canadians. And even as early as 1991, it found that smuggling was a big issue. That the study's estimate is that the amount of money that smuggling was costing the federal government, just the federal government, was on the order of $500 million a year. That was in 1991, before the kinds of clippings that people have to look at, where the thing was beginning to get out of hand. And a lot of that was before the big increase in tobacco taxes in 1991, the 3 cents on a cigarette increase, which really, really sent things over the limit. So the evaluation per se came up with those rather narrow, almost anodyne kinds of conclusions. That when the evaluation itself was published in June of 1993, the world didn't come to an end. Needless to say, the Canadian Manufacturers Association thought it was a terrible study, and the anti-smoking rights people thought it was a brilliant study. The independent academic referees looked at it, thought it was pretty good, which is why it got published in the first place. But the story then really begins to unfold between June of 1993 and the spring of 1994, when the policy came.
After the release of the report, or about the same time as the release of the report, the Department of Finance was becoming very aware of the smuggling problem. Clippings that you guys got in the case study probably gave a good flavor of what was actually happening. We were looking at a time from 1993 versus 1991. Domestic cigarette shipments fell by 25%. Cigarette exports increased by almost 400%. Over the same period of time, the value of tobacco products seized increased by almost 175%. At the time that we made the announcement in early 1994, we estimated that illicit tobacco represented 40% of the tobacco market in Canada. The federal and provincial governments were probably losing, in 1993, $2 billion. Clearly, tobacco smuggling had to be addressed. There was 3 options that probably came to mind at the time to how we could address the smuggling issue. was the export tax. The export tax was introduced early in the 1990s and then was suspended. The export tax has a bit of a problem. What you can do is you can stop Canadian tobacco products from leaving Canada and coming back to Canada. But you can't do anything at all about American tobacco products coming into Canada. And at the time that we did the tobacco evaluation, we found that based upon seizure data, American cigarettes represented 10% of the illicit tobacco consumed in Canada. After the study, the period of the study, and it was included in one of the press clippings in the case file, RJR decided they're going to set up a plant in Puerto Rico and produce Canadian tobacco products. And an export tax, of course, is not even going to hit tobacco products such as that. It was an issue that we could increase enforcement. Well, Canada's got a really long border. It's awfully tough to put the degree of enforcement required to address the severity of the problem at the time. In 1991, there was increased enforcement measures announced. In 1992, the amount spent on enforcement was doubled. In 1993, it was doubled again. Smuggling was still increasing, and it was increasing at an ever rapid pace. So the only option the federal government felt that it had in its hands was to reduce tobacco taxes. February 8th, 1994, the Prime Minister announced in the House that effective the following day, the federal government was going to reduce taxes on cigarettes by $5 a carton. Furthermore, it went on to say that if the provinces reduced their tobacco taxes by the $5 and increased their reduction, for every dollar above $5, the federal government would match it. This way, the federal government allowed provinces to determine the severity of smuggling in each and every area of Canada. And hence, the tax cut could be targeted to those areas where the problem was the most severe. In Quebec, remember at the time, they were estimating that over half the cigarettes consumed in Quebec were contraband. It's interesting to note at the time of the tobacco tax cut, we estimated that in fact the revenue loss to the federal government would only amount to $300 million. And in subsequent years, we actually estimated that the federal government would experience a revenue gain. And it was because of the track that smuggling was on at the time of the tax cut. If we were an issue that has been brought up subsequent to the tax cut, it was the impact of the tax cut on consumption. And as the evaluation shows, price does matter. And if one was consuming tax-paid cigarettes, yes, the tax cut is going to influence your consumption patterns. It's probably going to lead to some increase among younger Canadians. All they were looking at was tax-paid cigarettes. But if you had a consumer that was already dealing in contraband tobacco, the price they were facing at the time of the tax cut was roughly $25 a carton versus the tax-paid price that was over $45. When the tax cut came in the province of Quebec and Ontario, the price fell to around $25 a carton, even less. That person was already facing, the person that was smoking illicit tobacco was already facing a low price. The fact that the tax cut came in would not influence their decision to consume. Kids are probably the most targeted of all in terms of the smuggled tobacco. It was much easier to find around schoolyards. You didn't have to worry about going over to the store and worrying about the fact that you're under 18. So the fact that we reduced the tobacco taxes probably had a positive influence in terms of what happens among younger Canadians. I think that's what will happen. Is there any questions that you guys?
That there has been an increase in youth smoking, is that correct? And would that be correlated with the lower price?
I know that certain survey data that have picked up certain blips. I think obviously the tax cut is going to have an influence on the decision of younger Canadians to smoke. I'm not sure though whether the surveys will be able to pick up the fact that a teenager had access to illicit tobacco prior to the tax cut. They might, if what they're doing is smoking something that's illegal to begin with, when they're asked the question, do you smoke? No. When they're now dealing with something that you actually bought at the store, it's a really tough call to make.
I think the big issue here is that the level of smuggling had gotten to a point where the government was losing control of the tax as an instrument of policy. That it's, if you like, so few people were smoking tax-paid cigarettes that the leverage that the federal government had through the tax was greatly diminished, and that so the point that Tom's making, I mean, it may well be that the amount of tax paid smoking is increased, but I mean, that's a natural consequence of the change in the policy. I mean, that's what's perspective. Yeah.
What is the long-term vision as to where they're going to go with this?
I don't know. Short answer. You mean in what sense?
In terms of, I mean, we're always competing health costs versus tax revenue versus show control.
I mean, there's sort of there's two sort of issues here. One is that in the United States, the tobacco growers are much more important than they are in Canada. So that the pricing policy in the United States, I think, is always going to be much more lenient than it is in Canada. So that we're always going to have a low-cost neighbor. Now, on the positive side, for historical reasons, I'm not a smoker, but the Canadian cigarettes taste and smell different from American cigarettes. So Canadians like to smoke Canadian cigarettes. So that to the extent that, so by and large, they're not going to smoke American cigarettes, imported cigarettes. So that there goes two sort of competing pressures, I think. That yeah, there's that cheaper product not always available. But on the other hand, Canadians would rather smoke Canadian cigarettes.
I was just going to elaborate on what Don's saying. I think it's important that early on in the mid-'80s, when Minister of Finance was standing up in the House of Commons saying that taxes are useful to discourage people from smoking, I don't think the government has lost touch with that theme. I think that we realize that price and consumption do matter. But now what's come into the mix is this whole issue of the social consequences of having illicit tobacco. And it's created sort of like a three-way balance, if you like. And I think if the government was faced with a situation where there would be no more illicit tobacco out there, they might seriously look at raising tobacco prices again.
Well, yeah, let's take that just another step further. So I think if the day that we submitted our evaluation to the Tax Evaluation Advisory Committee, if they had said to us, what should we do? Probably our advice would be nothing. Leave the tax the way it is. That just based on what was in that study, that what really tipped the balance was that the data that we were getting from the export data showed that the smuggling was just getting totally out of hand. The $2 billion that Tom was talking about. I mean, that's just something you can't, from a tax point of view, you just can't afford to put up with. And from a policy point of view, it shows you that your policy's not working.
And I think from an even larger perspective, there was a general feeling that Canadians don't care. I mean, you're losing this good order of good government and law. People were showing total disrespect for the fact that it was illegal. Nobody cared that it was illicit tobacco.
Oh,
you mean that became an even larger political issue than even the details of how much money you're losing.
And in fact, we had a guy in our office who, even when we were in non-smoking,
no longer there,
insisted in smoking in his office and insisted on smoking smuggled cigarettes. And when his supplier got caught, he was able to find a new supplier in 5 minutes. That's how easy it was to get smuggled cigarettes. I mean, it was just
the breakdown in the way that we govern ourselves as a society.
Yeah. But yeah.
Was something missing when, like, it's hard to measure consumption. You have to look at what is actually being shipped. That's your measure of consumption. I find saying consumption is misleading. But how much is actually destroyed by the federal government? And is that factored into the shipping numbers? I mean, if you have exports and you're including those as some sort of consumption, but they're also destroying something not being consumed.
I presume the story cigarette you're talking about the ones that are confiscated.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's still measured in the export numbers, but it's also been registered as seizures.
But it's not actually being consumed.
No, and in fact, we were trying to measure a marketplace for a product that's illegal. It's very difficult to do. We were very fortunate in the case of cigarettes that the primary source of the product was exports. And we were able to actually create an econometric model that looked at changes in exports relative to the tax rate in Canada, the costs of being caught, along with variables that might explain why Canadians, when they go to the United States, purchase cigarettes.
But you didn't include the totals that were destroyed when you talk about consumption.
When we talk about consumption in terms of the evaluation itself, we were sort of concerning ourselves with tax paid consumption. So the amount that's being destroyed is not an issue. In terms of explaining domestic consumption, we created a model that had a real tax rate in Canada, and we measured it from a certain point in time on what influence changes in the tax rate had on consumption. Using that variable, we're actually able to measure changes in the level of illicit tobacco consumed in Canada. So we were actually trying to measure it in two different ways.
Is there also a difference between demand and consumption? Like if you were surveying people and said how much do you smoke? And you said
anything from that, and has it been led to speculate on the size of the underground economy? Or do they still believe, as StatsCan suggests, that it's about 2 or 3% of the overall economy? My sense is that if we have learned anything from that exercise, is that in the case of alcohol, it's probably an immense amount of the alcohol consumed that is also illicit. And since our tax structure is immensely different from that of the US across the board, the implication either we have found the optimal differential between Canada and the US, and therefore it's not very costly, or the underground economy is much more like 15% of GDP and not 2 or 3 or 4%, as the poets of StatsCan suggest.
Let me come at that in a couple of ways. A couple of years ago, one of my bosses tried to give a talk in Washington. Do you let it go in?
Hey, Steve. Okay. That's it.
Could you move in behind him? That's right. Good, good. And you move in behind her. That's great. That's great. Yeah. That's great. Thanks.